Worms Cathedral. St. Peter's Cathedral, German, Wormser Dom, is a Roman Catholic church and former cathedral in Worms, southern Germany. The cathedral is located on the highest point of the inner city of Worms and is the most important building of the Romanesque style in Worms. It is closely associated with Bishop Burchard and the high point of Worms history in the 12th and 13th centuries. It was the seat of the Catholic Prince-Bishopric of Worms until its extinction in 1802 during German mediatisation. After the extinction of the bishopric, it was reduced in status to that of a parish church. However, it was bestowed the title of minor basilica in 1925 by Pope Pius XI. Most of the cathedral was finished by 1181, however the west choir and the vaulting were built in the 13th century. The elaborate south portal was added in the 14th century, and the central dome has been rebuilt. Great events associated with the cathedral include the nomination of Leo Roman IX as Pope in 1048, the Concordat of Worms which ended the investiture controversy in 1122, the marriage of Emperor Frederick Roman II to Isabella of England in 1235, and the Diet of Worms in 1521, during which Martin Luther was condemned. History. Before the cathedral. St. Peter's Cathedral is located on the highest hill in the city. Since this hill was safe from flooding, it has been inhabited by people since the 3rd millennium BC. Celtic inhabitants were succeeded by the Germanic tribe of the Vangines, after whom the area around Worms received the name Wonegau. They were conquered by the Romans, who established a commercial center and temple area on the hill. The decline of the Roman Empire led to the abandonment of the Roman garrison at Worms in 401. 12 years later, the Burgundians took over Worms after they were settled within the empire by the Romans, with the task of protecting the empire's borders. When they sought to shake off Roman overlordship in 435, they were defeated in battle by the Romans. A year later, the Huns crossed the Rhine and massacred many Burgundians. Church of Brunshildis. After the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, the Franks came into the Rhine Valley and took over Worms by force. At the same time, they converted to Christianity. When the Frankish realm was divided into 3 parts under the Merovingians, Worms belonged to Austrasia. After the rulers of Austrasia and Neustria married each other's sisters, a war broke out, which led to the death of both rulers and one of the sisters. The widow of the Austrasian ruler, Brunshildis, lived at Worms around 680. She and her successor, Dagobert I, had a church built on top of the foundations of the Roman Forum, according to medieval sources. This church was a predecessor of the current building. There is no archaeological evidence for this church. Excavations carried out at the beginning of the 20th century suggest a larger predecessor build which, given its size, was probably Carolingian. Whether this was an expansion of a Merovingian building or not is unclear. Cathedral of Bishop Burchard of Worms. Berthulf was the first known bishop of Worms in 614. A new church was laid out, with the dimensions of the current building, under Bishop Burchard of Worms at the beginning of the 11th century. He succeeded in persuading the Salians to abandon their fort in the city, on which he erected the Paulus Stift from 1002/3. The old cathedral was demolished and the construction of the new one occurred simultaneously. It was a cross-shaped basilica with 2 semicircular choirs built on an east-west orientation. In 1018, the cathedral was consecrated in the presence of the emperor, but the western part of the building collapsed only 2 years later and had to be rebuilt. The church had a flat wooden roof. According to Burchard's biography, the cathedral was magnificently furnished in the 1030s and 1040s. Thus, there is mention of columns with golden capitals which cannot have been the church's main columns. Most likely, Burchard's cathedral was a pier basilica, since no remains of columns difficult to acquire in the 11th century anyway have been found. Only the foundations of the west towers and the treasury north of the choir, which was probably built at the end of the 11th century, survived subsequent rebuilding. In 1110, the cathedral was consecrated for the second time. More damage had probably occurred, whose removal was followed by this renewed consecration. Cathedral of Bishop Burchard Roman II of Worms. The rebuilding in the 12th century resulted, essentially, in the current cathedral. Around 1130, probably because of further damage to the building, Bishop Burchard Roman II began the demolition of the church built by his predecessor Burchard I and the construction of a new church. The whole eastwork with its towers and cupola were completed by him in the period up to c. 1144. The nave and westwork were erected between 1160 and 1181 by his successors Conrad I and Conrad Roman II. The latter consecrated it on to May 1181. The cathedral has features of the late Romanesque style, such as being completely vaulted and is decorated in line. Several religious buildings of the area are modeled on the cathedral's decoration, such that one can speak of a Worms style. Additionally, the elevation resembles the imperial cathedrals in Speyer and Mainz. The gradual progress of the rebuild can be charted with dendrochronology. Lumps were donated for the west choir in 1172, and Bishop Conrad Roman II was buried there in 1192. In former times, the Johanneskirche Worms stood on the south side of the cathedral and served as its parish church and baptismal chapel, until it was demolished in 1812. Renovations of Johannes von Dalberg. About 100 years after the third consecration, the construction of the chapel of St. Nicholas was begun. A new south portal was built, east of which two more chapels for St. Anne and St. George were built in the first quarter of the 14th century. Since part of the northwest tower collapsed in 1429, it was under reconstruction until 1472. The resulting tower has some late Gothic details, but strictly adhered to the original shape of the tower, making it an extremely earlier example of conservational restoration. The Aegidius Chapel, now the Mary Chapel, was built in the east part of the north side aisle in 1480/1485. Towards the end of the century, under Bishop Johann von Dalberg, the original Romanesque cloisters west of the chapel of St. Nicholas were renovated, resulting in 5 monumental late Gothic reliefs on the life of Jesus, which are now located in the north side aisle of the cathedral: Tree of Jess 1488, Annunciation 1487, Birth of Christ. A 6th relief depicting the crucifixion was probably lost in the destruction of 1689. In the Andreastift Worms there are 4 large round keystones, about 88 cm 35 and in diameter, decorated with coats of arms, which derive from the cloisters, and were donated by Bishop Ruprecht of Regensburg and Canons Philip von Florsheim, Urfo von Gemmingen, and Wilhelm von Stockheim. Another cloister keystone belonging to the Archbishop of Cologne and Cathedral Schalister Hermann, Roman IV of Hesse, is now located above the entrance of Neuburg Abbey Church in Heidelberg. The foundation stone of the cloisters from the year 1484, which had been thought lost, was found during cleaning in the Doms Lapidarium at the end of February 2014. Protestant Reformation to French Revolution. The importance of the diocese and the cathedral at Worms derives from the Diet of Worms in 1521. Shortly after the Diet, some Worms congregations converted to the teachings of Martin Luther. In 1556, all parishes in the Palatinate followed suit. During the 30 Years' War, Swedish troops held the city from 1632 to 1635, and the cathedral was used for Protestant services. In the 9 Years' War, Heidelberg, Mannheim, Speyer, and Worms were devastated at the command of King Louis Roman XIV. Churches were plundered, and though the attempt to blow up the cathedral failed, it was heavily damaged by fire. Bishop Franz Ludwig von Pfalz-Neuburg had the cathedral restored in 1698. Some Baroque elements date to this time, like the windows of the Silver Chamber and the high altar of Balthasar Neumann. The renovation of the cathedral was nullified by French revolutionary troops. At the end of 1792, Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Frankfurt were sacked by revolutionary troops. It served as a stable and a tavern. Between 1818 and 1830 the cloisters were demolished, and the stones from it were auctioned off. Renovation 1886, 1935. A full renovation of St. Peter's Cathedral only began in 1886. Because of structural weaknesses and damage suffered in the fire of 1689, the west choir had to be completely rebuilt. Great importance was placed on reusing as much of the original stone as possible. In the outer wall, this was taken so far that today all but a small portion of the old stones are in their original locations. On the inside wall, large flat stones had to be used and faithfully reconstructed. The sharply bent dosseret over the central rosette window was not rebuilt since it was blamed for the structural issues. Today the dosserets run perpendicular to the edge of the rosette and frame it clearly. The general renovations, which also included renovation of the chapel of St. Nicholas, the reconstruction of the whole floor, and the addition of an entirely new crypt for the tombs of the Salians under the high choir, were only completed in 1935. In the course of the renovation work, in 1920 the head architect, Philip Brand, was standing on the scaffolding when a dachshund attacked and attempted to bite him on the leg. He stepped to the side and as a result escaped from a falling stone which had broken loose above him, killing the dog. In the upper left of the south portal, at the edge of the window in the left corner, is a statue of the dachshund. Philip Brand had this installed as a small memorial. In the Allied bombing on 21 February and 18 March 1945, the cathedral was damaged by a bomb, which did not affect the interior. The roof burnt, but the vaults remained intact. Architecture. The cathedral is a pier basilica with two choirs and a transept. A central tower is located on the crossing, another over the western choir. Both choirs are flanked by two round staircase towers. The nave is vaulted in various ways. The central aisle has rib vaulting, while the side aisles have groin vaults. The apse of the west choir takes the form of an octagon and is decorated with various rosette windows. Glass windows. As a result of the Oppau explosion on 21 September 1921, nothing remains of the medieval glass windows. The contemporary glass of the cathedral is quite varied. As well as simple clear or milky glass in the transepts, are complicated pictorial windows, especially in the chapels, like the colored glass windows of Heinz-Hindorf in the Chapel of Mary, which depict scenes from Mary's life and the 14 Holy Helpers, 1986-1988, and the Geschichtspinster 1992 in the Chapel of St. George. An unusual political statement is found in the depiction of the Biblis nuclear power plant as the Tower of Babel in a series of examples of human sinfulness. Burials. Sarcophagi in the crypt. 4 Salian princes were buried in the altar space of the Frankish church and were then built over. Another 5 followed by 1046. These are the ancestors and relatives of Emperor Conrad Roman II. Conrad the Red, Duke of Lorraine, great-grandfather plus 955. Judith, Duchess of Carinthia, grandmother plus 991. Henry, Count of Wormskau, father plus 990/991. Judith, sister plus 998. Conrad I, Duke of Carinthia, uncle plus 1011 and 11. Matilda, wife of the preceding plus 1031/32. Queen Matilda plus 1034, consort of Henry I of France and daughter of Conrad Roman II, transferred to Worms in 1046. Conrad Roman II, Duke of Carinthia, cousin, son of Conrad I plus 1039. Bishop Aesjo, successor of Bishop Burchard, plus 1044. These sarcophagi have been located in a specially built crypt since the beginning of the 20th century. Since the floor level of the transept and the east choir is over 6 meters above ground level, one must assume that there was a crypt below it. Graves. There are a number of grave monuments, gravestones, and grave plates in the cathedral, including Rienbold Bayer of Boppard plus 1364, brother of Bishop Dietrich Bayer of Boppard plus 1384, Dietrich of Bettendorf 1518-1580, deacon and bishop of Worms, Wilhelm of Efferen 1563-1616, bishop of Worms, Eberhard of Heppenheim plus 1559, canon, nephew of Dom Deacon of Speyer 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 of Speyer. Johannes of Heppenheim plus 1555. France Rudolph of Hettersdorf 1675-1729, canon and donor of the Nicholas altar. Johann Adam of Hoheneck plus 1731, deacon of Worms, Worms. Johann Franz Jacob Anton of Hoheneck 1686-1758, canon of Worms, deacon of Mainz. Landolf of Hoheneck plus 1247, Bishop of Worms, posthumous epitaph from 1756. Franz Karl Friedrich of Hohenfeld 1696-1757, deacon. Christoph Jodok of Ketteler 1661-1735, canon. Philip of Rodenstein 1564-1604, Bishop of Worms. Georg of Skonenberg 1530-1595, Bishop of Worms, donated the George altar for his tomb outside in the former cloisters. Burchard Roman II, also Bucco or Buggo plus 1149, Bishop of Worms and builder of the Ostwork of the Dome. Chapel of St. Nicholas. In the course of the third period of construction, an early Romanesque chapel in honor of St. Nicholas of Myra was built, which was consecrated in 1058. Its consecration inscription and the tympanon of the former entrance to the cathedral, with one of the oldest known depictions of St. Nicholas, are preserved. It was apparently used to store a relic of the saint, which had been brought by Empress Theophanu from Byzantium at the time of her marriage to Otto Roman II in 972. The current chapel of St. Nicholas was built on the same location between 1280 and 1315 in the Gothic style, with two aisles, immediately west of the man portal on the south side aisle of the cathedral. At this time, when St. Nicholas was still buried in Myra, his cult spread through the West, and he was revered as patron of various groups and helper in many matters. This could explain the unusual size and sumptuousness of the chapel. The Jesuit and Bollandist Daniel Paprock 1628-1714 saw the original Worms relic of St. Nicholas in 1660. He described it as a finger bone of the saint, which at that time was stored in the cathedral sacristy, but had previously been displayed in his own chapel. He states also that the Worms relic was always immersed in oil, just as the relic of St. Nicholas in Bari is to this day. Paprock also mentions a still extant sumptuous consecration, offering from Queen Constance of Sicily plus 1198 to St. Nicholas. The old relic o Nicholas was lost in the destruction during the 9 Years' War. At the end of the 20th century, a new one was acquired, which is kept once more in the Chapel of Nicholas in a modern reliquary. The chapel was originally part of the cloisters, which were located immediately to the west, and was hidden by them for half its length. When the remains of the cloisters were finally cleared away in 1830, the structure of the chapel fell out of balance, so that they finally had to completely dismantle it in 1920/27, like the West Choir a few years earlier, install new foundations and rebuild it anew. On this same occasion, they also attempted to correct the proportions of the chapel, which had become ungainly after the removal of the cloisters, by extending it to the west by a half vault. The current southern entranceway to the chapel derives from modern times, but its tympanon comes from the portal which formerly led from the cloisters into the chapel. The furnishings of the chapel of St. Nicholas consist today of pieces which were all originally intended for other contexts. The Gothic carved altar comes from southern Germany, and was only acquired a few decades ago. The late Gothic baptismal font was originally located in the Johanneskirche, which was demolished in the 19th century. The almost life-size Gothic depiction of three young women was in a nearby abbey. The intense blue-red windows immerse the chapel in an almost mystic twilight. In the highly elevated roof of the chapel, the collection of architectural decorations and casts of them are housed, while the cellar houses the central heating of the cathedral. The chapel now serves as the baptismal chapel of the cathedral and is used for weekday services. Thus it has appropriated the functions of the old Johannes Church. High altar. Franz Ludwig of Pfalz-Neuburg, Prince-Elector of Mainz and Prince-Bishop of Worms, left enough money in his will to have a new high altar built. His successor, Prince-Bishop Franz Georg of Schönborn, asked his brother Friedrich, the Bishop of Würzburg, to provide the builder Johann Balthasar Neumann for the project. The latter produced the new high altar made of gilt, wood and multicolored marble. Organs. Main organ Kleis 1985. Kleis Orgelbau built a swallow's nest organ with 3 manuals and 34 registers in 1985. The machine has a mechanical playing action. The tracker action is electronic. Choir organ Oberlinger 1996. In addition, there is also a choir organ with mechanical playing and tracker action in the style of the choir organs of Aristide Cavail-Coll, which was built in 1996 by Oberlinger. The special feature of this organ's design is that it is extremely compact for its disposition, and at the same time, as a result of a pipe construction specially developed by Oberlinger, it can be moved about 50 cm 20 in away from the wall. This compact structure was necessary so that view of the sumptuous high altar from the nave wouldn't be obscured by the organ. A special construction of the air intake was required to achieve this small size. The design was accomplished by organ master and architect Wolfgang Oberlinger in close partnership with the diocese's architects and conservators. The organ was arranged by Oberlinger's Windesheim workshop in collaboration with the organist Daniel Roth. The instrument was intoned by Jean-Pierre Swiderski, a noted expert on the designs of Aristide Cavail-Coll. Bells. Before the destruction of Worms in 1689, during the 9 Years' War, 6 bells hung in the 4 towers of the church. In 1728, the cathedral received a new 6-part ring. In the course of the secularization at the end of the 18th century, these bells were confiscated. When the cathedral became a parish church, 4 bells were hung in the southeast tower with the notes B flat, G flat, and a flat. They were destroyed by aerial bombing at the end of the Second World War. 3 bells were cast in 1949 by Albert Junker of Berlin to replace the lost ring with the notes C, E, and G. They were made of a special metal called Berliner Sonderbronze, a tin-free copper silicon alloy. These were named after Peter and Paul, the cathedral's patron saints, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and Saint Conrad of Pargem, known also as Brother Conrad. They were consecrated on Easter Sunday 1949 by the Bishop of Mainz, Albert Stower, and were hung in the southeast tower. To commemorate the 1000th anniversary of the cathedral's consecration in 2018, 5 new bells were added to the ring, and the old bells received new clappers. The additions consisted of 3 lighter bells with the notes of D and B, 1 middle-weight bell in the note of D, and a large bell in the note of B. The new bells were tuned to the notes of the other church bells in the city, including Holy Trinity Church and St. Magnus Church, in order to create a larger city peal when the bells of all 3 churches are rung together. All bells were cast by the Rinker Bell Foundry, located in Hesse. The names of the bells and their inscriptions were designed by local artist Klaus Kreyer. The first official ringing of all 8 bells, followed by ringing of the city peal, occurred on the Saturday before Pentecost, the 19th of May 2018. Worms Cathedral in the Nibelungen Saga. An episode in the Nibelungen Lied takes place at the portal of the cathedral. The rival queens Brunhild and Kriemhild disputed over which of their husbands, Siegfried or Gunther, has the higher rank, and therefore which of them should enter the cathedral first. This is a key episode which leads to Siegfried's death and the destruction of the Nibelungs. The portal in question was on the north side of the cathedral and was considerably more elaborate before it was destroyed in 1689. In connection with this episode, the Nibelungen Festspiele have taken place on an outdoor stage in front of the cathedral since 2002.